It is 11 p.m. in Las Vegas, 9 a.m. in Damascus, and 4 on a Monday afternoon here in Seoul. I'm Moon Gun-young. This is ARIRANG, Korea's only global network. It seems the Korean economy is becoming even more dependent on its two biggest conglomerates, Samsung and Hyundai Motor. The combined operating profit of the two conglomerates accounted for more than 30% of the combined operating profit of all Korean companies for the first time in 2012, according to market research site Chaebol.com. Samsung accounted for about 21% of local companies' combined operating profit and Hyundai Motor about 9%. That is a combined increase of about 6% compared to the previous year. Experts have raised the concern that the country's heavy reliance on the two conglomerates could more easily trigger financial instability when the country is hit by a crisis. And it's becoming harder for young people to find a stable job, and recent figures tell the tale here in Korea. Last year, over 20% of young people aged 15 to 29 were hired as temporary workers for their first job. This is according to Statistics Korea on Monday. Now, that is double the percentage of young people hired as temp workers back in 2008. Over the same 5-year period from 2008 to 2013, the number of young people in the same age group who found stable long-term jobs dropped by half to 128,000. Well, experts say the problem is a lack of high-quality jobs, which is in turn a result of the effects of the global financial crisis. This is disheartening news for young job seekers who were already struggling with a low employment rate of 40% as of last month, which put Korea 29th out of 34 OECD countries in terms of youth employment. Meanwhile, Seoul shares rebounded on this Monday from a 4-month closing low previously after weak U.S. non-farm payrolls provided a lift in risk sentiment by halting the yen skid, bolstering gains in exporters such as Samsung Electronics and Hyundai Motor. At the closing bell, the benchmark Kospi closed up 0.5% at 1949, halting a 3-session skid. The Chegavi Kazakh also finished in positive territory by just about that much, while on the foreign exchange counter, the Korean currency closed stronger against the greenback at roughly 1,057 won. And we kick off our 5-part series on Korea's industrial competitiveness with parts and materials. The sector, which used to depend heavily on imports, is now leading the nation's exports thanks to active corporate investment and government support. Our Hwang Ji-hye looks at the sector's prospects and the challenges that remain.
This Korean semiconductor packaging company has recently found a way to make the world's thinnest chip.
Normally, companies produce 1 millimeter thick semiconductors, but we're able to produce them with a thickness of half of that. We are ahead of every other company.
Until around 10 years ago, Korean companies hardly reported any breakthrough in the manufacturing of parts and materials, but it's a different story these days. Now Korea is the world's 5th largest parts and materials exporting nation, closely following Japan. And with the domestic parts and materials sectors getting a boost recently, the trade surplus last year reached a record high of nearly $100 billion. That is nearly 40 times larger than the sector's trade surplus recorded in 2001. Exports of parts and materials currently take up almost half of the nation's overall exports. Experts say the improving competitive edge of Korea's finished goods are also helping the parts and materials sectors.
The rise in exports of products like television, mobile phones, automobiles, and machinery have pushed up demand for key components of those goods.
The Seoul government is determined to make Korea the world's 4th largest exporter of parts and materials by 2020, surpassing Japan and more than doubling the sector's trade surplus to $250 billion. While the nation has made a leap forward in manufacturing parts, it still lags behind in developing new materials.
The problem is Korea is far behind Japan in the area of new materials, while China is catching up fast in making parts.
To narrow the gap with Japan, the government has promised to pour $280 million into the local industry every year until 2025. Hwang Ji-hye, ARIRANG News.
And shifting our focus to the nation's political realm, kicking off the annual New Year's press conference by leaders of the nation's main political parties, the chief of the main opposition Democratic Party took aim at President Park Geun-hye earlier this Monday in his first press conference of the new year. In his remarks, he also stressed universal welfare and a gradual reunification with North Korea. The ruling Infinity Party is scheduled to hold a presser on Tuesday. ARIRANG News Kim Hyun-ji reports.
Democratic Party chief Kim Han-gil criticized President Park's New Year's speech, saying she failed to provide concrete details on how she intends to improve the livelihoods of ordinary people in a country with the world's highest suicide rate among the young and senior citizens.
The president did not mention economic democratization or welfare, even once during her New Year's speech. It's shocking.
Kim said his party will promote welfare support aimed at helping people live a dignified life.
My party will strengthen policy for education, housing, and healthcare to stop the collapse of the middle class and restore the ladder of hope that enables the poor to move into the upper class.
Specifically, the Democratic Party chief said his party will push for free school meals, free high school education, and cutting the cost of college tuition in half. He added that he and his party will work toward putting a cap on rental prices, including jeonse, which requires that a large lump sum deposit be paid up front and is returned in full at the end of the rental period. Kim also called for a strengthening of public health care policy and an expansion of public medical facilities for patients with severe diseases and dementia. He stressed that the party will oppose any attempt by the government to privatize health care or railway services. He also said he welcomed President Park's concept of reunification as a jackpot for the two Koreas, but stressed that the government must be sure to take practical steps to improve inter-Korean relations and prepare for a gradual and peaceful reunification with North Korea.
Targeting the local elections in June, the Democratic Party leader vowed to overcome the factionalism within his party and respond quickly to the public's demands. To break a long-standing deadlock in Parliament, he pledged to push for an independent investigation into the alleged illegal electioneering by state institutions in 2012. Kim Hyun-ji, ARIRANG News.
Now, a powerful medical doctors association has warned it is ready to go on strike in March to protest a government plan to launch for-profit hospitals and telemedicine services. Park Ji-won reports.
The Korean Medical Association, which boasts some 90,000 doctors as its members, says it will go on general strike starting March 3rd unless the government changes plans to establish for-profit hospitals and telemedicine services.
The association opposes the government's drive towards telemedicine and for-profit hospitals and demands a fundamental reform of the nation's health insurance system.
However, the Doctors Association is open to dialogue.
Depending on the negotiations with the government, the strike could be delayed, according to an emergency planning committee.
The Health Ministry has also shown a willingness to start talks with the association.
The government respects the Medical Association's decision to defer the general strike and engage in dialogue through a consultative group. The government will enter talks with an open mind.
The situation was sparked when the government put ads in newspapers last week promoting the advantages of telemedicine services and for-profit hospitals. The Medical Association is strongly opposed to both, saying they will impair the quality of medical services for citizens. In its statement, the Doctors Association said the telemedicine program has never been fully tested in Korea, and it is not yet a reliable way to make a diagnosis. The Medical Association also said the government is misleading citizens, disguising the establishment of for-profit hospitals as if it is an investment measure for mid-sized hospitals, when it is actually aiming to establish for-profit hospitals. In response, the Health Ministry said the teleconsultations are mostly aimed at low-risk patients and those who live in remote areas where visiting doctors is not easy. The government also said the for-profit hospitals will be allowed to run additional projects, like attracting patients from other countries, which will not affect the public nature of the medical service in Korea. The government has been pushing for the establishment of both, along with other deregulating measures, as a means to expand the nation's medical industry. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
So last month it was the railway workers and now the nation's medical doctors. Now doctors here in Korea threatening to strike in protest against the government's latest plan to overhaul medical services. So what do they want and what are the key points of contention? Joining us live in the studio to give us an in-depth analysis is Dr. Kim Byung-ju, head of KLMP Consulting and our regular commentator on this program. Good afternoon to you, Dr. Kim.
Good afternoon.
So the Korean Medical Association says it will launch a strike on March 3rd if their demands are not met.
Right.
So what does this mean for the country?
Basically, it could mean a lot of different things. Hopefully we'll get into more details case by case here, but what was happening was a Saturday afternoon, medical doctors got together, about 500 of them, representing the entire nation's medical doctors, 95,000 of them indeed, and this 500 medical doctors who formed this special committee, they went on for about 8-9 hours, well into the very early morning, Sunday morning, and they decided that by March 3rd, if there is not enough progress in their talks with the government, they will stage nationwide strike. And of course, this is a conditional one, as they said. If there is no meaningful progress in their talks with the government itself. So I think it will be a little bit premature to call this as a medical doctors' strike yet, because they have left a considerable room here. And also, government has expressed their strong interest to carry out their dialogue with these medical doctors as well. So, I think we will just have to look into all these issues that are on the table and how both sides, the government on one hand and the medical doctor on the other, actually conduct their dialogue in coming about a month, which is a very long time in politics here.
Right. So there are two key points that the medical doctors are against, one of which is telemedicine services, they call it. What is this?
Telemedicine itself is basically diagnosis that could be produced by these medical doctors without actually seeing the patients face to face. And they are going to do this through the computer online or even telephone lines or whatever. And that is what government is pushing for, allowing this regulation to allow this kind of form of diagnosis being taken place without having the patient and the doctor sitting in the same room together. And basically the medical doctors, KMA especially, they argue against this idea, saying that this whole idea could actually undermine the safety of the patients and could undermine overall reliability of medical services. But the thing is, behind that, of course, their concern is these small size of clinics that are all around the country actually could be affected big time, as more patients could actually prefer having this telemedicine service connected with them to those medical doctors who are sitting in the large size, big national top level hospitals. So that's a very big concern in their minds. But the government is saying, look, we have so many patients in this country who have chronic conditions which do not necessarily require them to see the doctors face to face. And to see the doctors face to face, sometimes they have to travel for long distances, and especially those older patients who live in the countryside, it's so much effort on their side. And in the city residents, standing in long lines to see the doctors itself is an inconvenience for the common people here. So government is saying that needs to be allowed. Of course, in the back of government's mind, of course, they have this creative economy in mind as well, combining the IT services together with medical services. That's also hidden agenda there, and so that's the pro and con sides that I can talk about.
So what the government is pushing for is actually what they're arguing is for the convenience of the patients, and the medical doctors are arguing for the safety of the patients.
While being concerned about the small-sized clinics.
All right. Okay. What about this other point of contention, allowing hospitals to open business subsidiaries?
Basically, right at this point, the hospitals are allowed to conduct their own businesses of running hospitals, but not other businesses, roughly speaking at this point. And what government has in my mind is allowing these kind of entities to set up their own subsidiaries, services that can provide additional services other than the medicine itself, which could include like tourism services that could invite patients from overseas, and also business consulting services that could help their mother hospital to go overseas and set up their presence overseas and so on. So they want to expand the overall boundary of the business for this kind of hospital corporations, if you will, if that's the proper word or not, I need to check. But they want to expand the boundary of the business. But the critics are saying, including the KMA members and medical doctors who are criticize government, saying, well, this is actually diverting focus from the hospital from their main business, which could actually compromise overall quality of the service itself. And also, when some of these hospitals make a lot of money and create big profits, they need to be reinvested in medical services. Otherwise, this profit, when they are used to open other kinds of non-medical services, that could actually mean higher cost for the common people, as well as the downgrade of the service quality as a whole. So that's what these medical doctors who are talking about nationwide strikes are saying.
Now, so speaking of the fees, actually, let's turn to what they say is the central issue here.
Yeah.
It's actually the medical insurance fee hikes. Now, what we're hearing is that they're saying the government basically agrees with medical doctors on the need to raise the fees.
Right.
Then why all this trouble?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. By the way, as you briefly mentioned, this overall increase of the insurance payment for medical services itself is the key agenda, and that seems to be the main driver that seems to be driving the overall situation here. And some of the critics of the medical doctors are saying, well, when they talk about this telemedicine and when they talk about this business subsidiaries, those are all facade, basically. And what they really have in mind is to increase overall pricing for the medical services that they're providing that could be covered by the national insurance. All right, so what's the contentious? Of course, medical doctors are saying right now the payment that's being paid to the medical doctors in return for medical services is too low, too cheap. And some of the medical doctors are saying, comparing with OECD average, these are their words, comparing with OECD average, Korea's overall pricing is like a 1/4 of the OECD average. We have to be careful about the details, but that's what they're saying. And so they say these overall pricing needs to be raised so that medical doctors will continue to provide good quality services to the Korean people, right? But however, the government is saying, okay, look, fine. We sort of recognize the overall level of this kind of payment itself is kept on the cheaper side, which, by the way, is a good news for common people, all of us, including you and I, included here. But they say, well, it's a little bit on the lower side. So we are willing to, government is saying, we are willing to discussing the possibility of raising them. But they're saying, but at the same time, we can do that with the condition that medical doctors will agree on talking more about including those services who are not currently covered by the national insurance to be included as these kind of covered services as well, which will be controlled, whose pricing will be controlled, right? So that's what government is saying, and then medical doctors are saying, well, that's not the main issue. Just overall, let's talk about raising the overall pricing.
All right. So all in all, the deadline is March 3rd. So what do we see ahead?
Well, the problem is KMA legally represents 95,000 medical doctors here in Korea. But medical doctors here in Korea, 95,000 of them, according to different reports, I think they are divided in like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 representing the small clinics that seem to go fully ahead with the KMA's position, supporting all these different issues here. But there is 1/3 of the medical doctors who are working in large-size hospitals who do not agree with the point number 1 and number 2, telemedicine and the business subsidiary. And then the other 1/3 are the medical doctors in training, and they're in a difficult position to express their own views. So whether this KMA can come up with a bigger than half majority vote by March 3rd, that will be a big question. So we'll have to wait and see on that one.
So they'll have to come to a consensus within its organization in order to come up with something by March 3rd.
Exactly.
All right, Dr. Kim Byung-ju, thank you so much for today. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Okay.
With rapid changes in the global economy, Up-to-date business and financial news has never been more essential. See what's making markets tick around the globe. We speak to the experts and cover the biggest financial stories.
North Korea provocation.
Quite good. We received a lot of positive feedback, especially from those abroad.
After a months-long tug-of-war, South Korea and the U.S. have finally settled on a new cost-sharing agreement for the stationing of U.S. troops in Korea. But some wonder whether the deal was the best Seoul could do. Our national defense correspondent Han Da-eun reports.
$866.6 million. That is the amount South Korea will pay this year to keep the more than 28,000 U.S. troops on the Korean peninsula. Seoul's foreign ministry says this was a successful deal, as Washington has settled on an amount that's $75 million less than what it initially wanted, despite automatic spending cuts known as the sequester that have slashed the military's budget. But what's more worthy of notice, officials say, is that the U.S. agreed on specific measures to enhance transparency. Washington had long been criticized by the South Korean public for not revealing how defense costs were spent. A new monitoring system will be set up that'll effectively track shared military expenditures, and the two sides will be required to submit annual spending reports to the Korea-U.S. Integrated Defense Dialogue, better known as KIDD. The U.S. will also report defense cost outlays on the peninsula to the Korean parliament.
We have made an effort to produce a reasonable outcome that's acceptable to the parliament and the people, taking into account the stationing conditions for the U.S. troops, as well as our government's financial capacity.
But some are critical of the deal, saying it has left several long-standing issues unresolved. They point out that Washington is not keeping its promise to shoulder the cost of relocating the main U.S. military base from Seoul to Pyeongtaek in 2016. Instead, they seem to be amassing a large amount of money and asking for more, but it's not clear how much has gone to the Pyeongtaek relocation. The deal will be taken to the parliament in early February for ratification. But amid such divided opinions, it looks like it won't necessarily be smooth sailing. Han Da-eun, ARIRANG News.
Amid the backdrop of tension and uncertainty on the Korean peninsula, South Korea's military has been placing extra emphasis on being combat ready to face any threat from North Korea. ARIRANG News' Kim Hyun-bin reports on winter training exercises currently underway on the outskirts of Korea's Olympic town of Pyeongchang.
지금 남북 관계는 그 어느 때보다 엄중한 상황입니다. 작년에 북한은 3차 핵실험을 감행하고 전쟁 위협을 서슴지 않았습니다. 그리고 최근 장성택 처형 등으로 더욱 예측 불가능하게 되었습니다.
It goes without saying that maintaining a staunch defense against possible North Korean provocations is one of the Park Geun-hye administration's key goals this year, and the remaining years of her term thereafter. And the president has made it clear that strengthening national security is very high on her agenda. To ensure readiness, the Defense Ministry initiated a winter exercise last week in Pyeongchang-gun, Gangwon-do Province, a place well known for its brutally cold winters, where temperatures regularly plunge below -20 degrees Celsius.
Scores of Special Forces cadets are busy training, despite the bone-chillingly cold temperatures. It's a clear display of South Korea's military might and readiness to fight off any attack from the north.
But it's just another day for South Korea's Special Forces. Whether it's blistering hot or numbingly cold, these men are ready to fight and successfully carry out their missions.
To successfully conduct our missions in extreme conditions, we are enhancing our combat capabilities through realistic training.
They showed off numerous maneuvers, with cadets skiing down slopes, sniping down potential enemies, while reaching their targets undetected. These types of training exercises are held throughout the nation periodically. They serve two purposes: ensuring complete military readiness to potential threats, and giving the public the peace of mind that the military can keep them safe from an unpredictable northern neighbor. Kim Hyun-bin, ARIRANG News, Pyeongchang.
It is a dry yet very frosty day here in Seoul, but here now is a look at the weather conditions in your neck of the woods. And that brings us to the end of this newscast, but stay tuned to ARIRANG. We have a lot more coming your way on Early Edition at 6.